guy called Terry Rudge, who was the best wrestler I ever wrestled. Most people don't know about him, but he was the best. And if you ask Finlay, people think me and him are good wrestlers. If you ask both of us, we'll both tell you that Terry Rudge was the best wrestler we ever wrestled.
William Regal has spent more than 4 decades in professional wrestling, working as a competitor, a trainer, and later as a global talent development executive, moving through nearly every major promotion in Britain, Europe, and North America along the way. Long before any of that, he was a teenager at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, working in Bobby Barron's Wrestling Challenge booth. In that booth, ordinary members of the public would pay to step in and try to beat the house wrestler. Regal was one of the men on the other side of that challenge, using real catch-as-catch-can submissions to defend the booth's prize money against anyone who walked up. That job did not leave room for cooperation or choreography. There was no script to fall back on, and no partner quietly helping him look good. Every single night at that booth was its own small test of whether his catch-as-catch-can training actually held up against a stranger who wanted to win just as badly as he did. That experience shaped everything Regal believes about wrestling. He does not judge greatness by how many titles someone won or how impressive their acrobatics looked. He judges it by anatomical consequence, defensive leverage, physical honesty, and crowd psychology. Rather than ranking wrestlers on drawing power or athleticism alone, his list builds a kind of technical map, one that blends classical British catch wrestling, stiff European heavyweight tradition, fast junior heavyweight innovation, and emotional North American storytelling into a single unified way of thinking about the business. Over the course of his career, in his autobiography, in interviews, and throughout his coaching work as a talent development executive, Regal has pointed to 10 wrestlers again and again as the ones who built his idea of what this sport should be. Some taught him how to hurt an opponent believably. Some taught him how to escape danger through leverage rather than muscle. Some taught him how to make a crowd feel something without ever raising their voice. Together, these 10 men represent more than 60 years of wrestling history, spanning 4 different weight divisions and several different countries. It is worth being clear about what this list is not. It is not a ranking based on who drew the biggest crowds, who held the most championships, or who could perform the most athletically impressive sequence of moves. Some of the names below never became household names outside of Britain at all, and a few would be unfamiliar even to longtime fans who only followed the biggest American promotions. What connects every single one of them is a shared set of values that Regal picked up first as a teenager defending a wrestling booth on the seafront, then refined across decades as a competitor, and finally passed on as a trainer shaping the next generation of the business. Here they are, counting down from 10 to 1, along with the specific lessons each one taught him. 10. Bryan Danielson. Danielson is the newest name on this list, and in many ways, he is the payoff for everything the other 9 wrestlers taught Regal. Their relationship goes back to the year 2000, when Regal was working at Memphis Championship Wrestling, WWE's developmental territory at the time. Regal noticed Danielson's technical discipline and work ethic almost immediately, and the two built a mentorship that lasted for decades. What makes Danielson so significant to Regal is not any single move or signature spot. It is the sheer range of skills he carries into every match. He has the defensive escapology and small joint manipulation that trace back to Johnny Saint. He has the stiff, uncompromising physical legitimacy that trace back to Fit Finlay. He has the conditioning, stamina, and smooth chain transitions that trace back to Marty Jones and John Cortez. He has the high-velocity, punishing impact that traces back to Mark Roco. And he has the sympathetic selling fire and body language that trace back to Ricky Steamboat. In Regal's eyes, Danielson is not one influence expressed through a new wrestler. He is nearly every influence expressed through one wrestler. Regal has described Danielson as the most complete professional wrestler of the modern era. Part of what earns that praise is Danielson's adaptability. He can work a match under British round rules, adjust to Mexican lucha libre, hold his own in Japanese strong style, thrive on the American independent scene, or headline a WWE pay-per-view, and in every single one of those settings, he looks like he belongs there. That kind of range is rare, and to Regal, it represents the clearest possible proof that pure fundamentals travel across any border or promotion, regardless of language, rule set, or audience expectation. Their bond eventually became public in the most direct way it could. Regal and Danielson teamed together under the name Blackpool Combat Club, a name Regal chose deliberately. Blackpool is where his own education in this business started, in that booth on the seafront, defending prize money against strangers. By attaching that name to the team, Regal was making a statement. Everything he learned as a teenager on on that beach was still alive and working at the highest level of the business, carried forward through the man he had trained for over 20 years. Think about how long that mentorship actually lasted. It began in the year 2000 in a WWE developmental territory and did not reach its most public expression until decades later, when the two of them stood side by side as an on-screen team in front of a modern audience. Very few teacher and student relationships in wrestling last that long, or travel through that many stages. From a green trainee learning the fundamentals, to an independent scene standout building his own reputation, to a full main event star, to finally standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who trained him. Regal watched every one of those stages happen in real time, which is part of why his praise for Danielson carries so much weight. It is not the reaction of a fan discovering a wrestler mid-career. It is the assessment of a teacher who watched every single piece of that skill set get built, one lesson at a time, over more than 20 years. There is also a certain symmetry in Danielson closing out this list at the number 10 position rather than sitting at the very top. Everything above him on this countdown represents a single lesson, a single tradition, a single piece of the puzzle Regal spent his career assembling. Danielson represents the assembled result. He earns his place here not because he is a separate influence in the way the other 9 are, but because he is living proof that the whole philosophy, once fully combined, actually works exactly the way Regal always believed it would. It says something important about Regal's standards that the most modern wrestler on this list is praised not for reinventing the sport, but for proving that the old lessons still hold up. Danielson does not represent something new, breaking away from Regal's tradition. He represents that tradition reaching its most complete and successful form yet. Every earlier name on this list gave Regal one piece of a larger puzzle. Danielson is where all of those pieces finally sit together in a single career, which is exactly why Regal talks about him differently from anyone else he has trained. 9. Ricky the Dragon, Steamboat. Steamboat is Regal's favorite wrestler from North America, and the wrestler he studied hardest to understand physical selling, meaning the way a wrestler shows pain, fatigue, and effort convincingly to an audience. Regal did not just casually admire Steamboat from a distance. During his own developmental years, he actively tracked down VHS recordings of Steamboat's famous 1989 trilogy of matches against Ric Flair. He set up a television at the bottom of a staircase in his home and performed a full hour of Hindu squats and step-ups while he watched those tapes, breaking down Steamboat's footwork and the specific way he reacted to pressure and pain. That study eventually turned into direct, practical experience. In 1993, Regal and Steamboat feuded in WCW, and that feud reached its climax at Fall Brawl, where Regal defeated Steamboat for the World Television Championship. Steamboat entered that match already carrying a rib injury, and Regal spent the entire bout attacking it, using knees, surfboard stretches, and backbreaker racks aimed directly at his ribs. That match reinforced a belief Regal has carried for the rest of his career. That simple, fundamental offense only reaches its full artistic potential when the selling around it stays consistent, from the first strike to the last pin attempt. A single knee to the ribs means very little if the opponent forgets about it 30 seconds later. It means everything if it shapes the way that opponent moves for the rest of the match. Steamboat's spot on this list is a reminder that Regal's philosophy is not only about stiffness or toughness for its own sake. Mechanics create emotion, in Regal's view, rather than sitting apart from it. A wrestler can hit as hard as they like, but if the reaction to that offense is not consistent and believable, none of the emotional payoff actually lands with the crowd watching. Steamboat is proof that Regal's most demanding technical standards and his most emotional storytelling instincts were never really two separate things at all. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for Regal to describe learning this much from a single feud with an opponent, rather than from a mentor or a trainer. Most of the names on this list taught Regal through years of instruction, direct coaching, or countless hours spent studying old footage from a distance. Steamboat taught him something just as important through 18 minutes of live competition on the other end of Regal's own offense, in a single televised match. That distinction matters, because it shows Regal did not treat his in-ring opponents as separate from his education. The preparation Regal put in before that feud even began also says something about how seriously he took the study of selling as its own discipline. Watching old tapes while doing an hour of squats is not the behavior of someone casually enjoying a favorite wrestler's matches for entertainment. It is the behavior of someone treating another man's body language as a subject worth mastering, the same way he treated leverage and submissions. Steamboat's craft was, to Regal, just as technical as any hold Johnny Saint ever applied, even though it lived entirely in facial expression and timing rather than in joints and mechanics. 8. Rollerball, Mark Roco. Mark Roco is the clearest proof on this list that Regal's philosophy is not opposed to speed or excitement. It is only opposed to speed and excitement that ignore physical logic altogether. Roco was a multiple-time world heavy middleweight champion in Britain, and he brought a faster, more aggressive style to the ring than most of his contemporaries. Where a lot of wrestlers of his era leaned on a slower, grinding pace, Roco pushed forward constantly, using relentless pressure instead of stalling to control a match. His biggest and most lasting impact on the wider wrestling world came outside of Britain. Roco traveled to New Japan Pro Wrestling and took on the role of the original masked Black Tiger. In that guise, he wrestled a historic series of matches against Satoru Sayama. Regal studied Roco closely to understand something easy to overlook. Speed does not have to come at the expense of physical honesty. Roco kept his matches quick and full of impact, but he never abandoned the grit and heel psychology that made his offense believable in the first place. He proved that pace and legitimacy do not have to be opposites, and that a wrestler can move fast without the match feeling weightless or disconnected from reality. For a philosophy built mostly around patient control, Roco is proof that Regal's ideas can stretch to fit an entirely different tempo, as long as the underlying physical logic never gets sacrificed for the sake of speed. What Regal took from Roco specifically was how to build continuous forward momentum inside a match without letting the story fall apart. Dramatic bumps and fast transitions can easily start to feel random if there is no structure holding them together. Roco managed to keep that structure intact, even while moving faster than almost anyone else of his generation, which is exactly why Regal returned to his matches so often while working out how to blend pace with realism in his own career. Roco's willingness to travel and adapt is also part of what makes him stand out on this list. Most of the other British names here spent the bulk of their careers working the same domestic circuits, refining a single, consistent approach for a familiar audience. Roco took his stiff, physical British style all the way to Japan and adjusted it against an opponent working in an entirely different tradition, and the resulting matches became historically important on their own terms. That willingness to blend styles rather than simply import one wholesale is a lesson Regal clearly absorbed, since his own career later took him across just as many countries and just as many different wrestling cultures. Roco's title reign as a multiple-time world heavy middleweight champion also placed him in an unusual middle ground between the lighter, more mobile wrestlers on this list and the heavier, more grinding names like Rudge and Finlay. 7. Steve Gray. Steve Gray was a long-serving British lightweight champion, and he taught Regal something that heavier, stiffer wrestling can sometimes overlook entirely: how to make an audience genuinely care about a smaller wrestler facing a much bigger opponent. Gray did not have the size of the heavyweights higher up this list. His entire game was built around pacing, timing, and believable vulnerability rather than power or size. What set Gray apart was the subtlety of his selling. He had a rare gift for communicating pain and exhaustion through small facial expressions rather than big, obvious reactions. Against larger opponents, he never reached for a power move that would look physically implausible for someone his size. Instead, he relied on defensive agility, careful spatial awareness, and precise timing to survive dangerous moments and slowly turn the tide of a match in his favor. Regal directly incorporated Gray's rhythmic approach into his own early matches on the Blackpool circuit. From Gray, Regal learned that an audience does not connect with a wrestler because that wrestler looks unbeatable and invincible. They connect because that wrestler looks like they are genuinely struggling and might actually lose. 6. John Cortez. John Cortez does not come with flashy highlight reels attached to his name, and that is exactly what makes him important on this list. Regal has described him as a true wrestler's wrestler, meaning someone whose matches impressed fellow professionals far more than they impressed a casual audience chasing spectacle and drama. What made Cortez special was his precision. He kept his matches tight, cutting out any wasted movement between one hold and the next. He maintained continuous physical contact with his opponents during transitions, never letting a sequence of holds look like two people politely taking turns. When he applied a headlock or a wrist lock, he distributed his body weight the way it would genuinely need to be distributed in a real physical struggle, rather than in a way that simply looked good from a distance in the arena or on camera. Cortez mattered to a young Regal because he proved that greatness in wrestling does not require a signature spot, a dramatic finish, or a moment built purely for reaction. It can live entirely in the smaller details, in exactly how cleanly one movement flows into the next, without any visible gap or hesitation. For a philosophy that prizes realism above almost everything else, Cortez might be the purest example available. There is nothing flashy to point to and call exciting in the conventional sense. There is only clean, careful technique, applied without a single wasted motion from bell to bell. Cortez worked through the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s within joint promotions, competing mostly in the lightweight and welterweight divisions. He never became a household name the way some of his contemporaries did, but among wrestlers who studied the craft closely, his matches were treated as something close to a technical textbook. That kind of quiet, internal respect mattered enormously to a young Regal, who was more interested in learning from wrestlers other wrestlers admired than from wrestlers the general public simply recognized. There is a reason Cortez sits in the middle of this list, rather than closer to either end. He is not a foundational figure in the way Rudge is, and he is not a synthesis figure in the way Danielson is. He occupies a very specific, narrower role, proof that the smallest technical details, the ones a casual viewer might never consciously notice, are exactly where a wrestler's true skill lives. Regal has built his entire coaching career around drilling those same small details into younger wrestlers, and Cortez is one of the clearest early examples of why that level of care actually matters. 5. Johnny Saint. Johnny Saint earned the nickname the Man of 1,000 Holds, and it is not difficult to understand why once you study his approach. Saint treated every hold his opponent applied as a mechanical problem with a built-in solution, rather than a situation to simply muscle his way out of. Instead of relying on raw strength to break free, he shifted his balance, altered the center of gravity in the exchange, and used his opponent's own forward momentum against them to reverse control of the hold entirely. His most famous sequence, known as the Lady of the Lake, remains one of the most talked about spots in British wrestling history, and it shows this philosophy in its purest form. Saint would drop to the mat looking completely helpless, folded up in a position that appeared to offer no defense whatsoever. That vulnerable posture was the trap itself. As soon as an eager opponent committed their full body weight to finish him off, Saint would pivot and use that very commitment against them, locking them into a pin attempt or a joint submission they never saw coming until it was already too late to escape. Saint's influence on Regal runs especially deep. Regal's own submission style, including the hold known as the Regal stretch, owes a real debt to the counter-wrestling concepts that Saint spent his entire career developing and refining. What Saint proved, more clearly and more completely than almost anyone else on this list, is that defense itself can be the single most compelling part of a wrestling match. A wrestler does not need to be the aggressor to be the most interesting person in the ring at any given moment. They simply need to understand their opponent's holds, weaknesses, and habits better than the opponent understands them. Saint's long career, stretching from the 1960s into the 2010s, was built almost entirely inside the round-based structure of British television wrestling, where matches had to tell a complete story in a limited number of short rounds. That format rewarded exactly the kind of compact, mechanical storytelling Saint specialized in. Every hold had to mean something quickly, and every escape had to feel earned rather than accidental. Few wrestlers on this list operated under tighter creative constraints than Saint did, and few made those constraints look as effortless as he did. What makes Saint's placement here especially important is how directly his ideas map onto Regal's own signature offense. When commentators or fans talk about the Regal stretch, they are really talking about a modern expression of the same counter-wrestling logic Saint spent decades refining, applying pressure at exactly the point where an opponent's own leverage runs out. That is not a loose or general inspiration. It is a specific, traceable line running from Saint's career directly into one of the holds most associated with Regal himself, which is part of why Saint sits comfortably in the top half of this list rather than further down it. Saint's international independent work later in his career also meant his ideas traveled well beyond British television, reaching audiences and training rooms that never saw his early rounds-based matches at all. That reach matters because it means the counter-wrestling logic behind moves like the Regal stretch did not stay locked inside one country's wrestling tradition. It moved outward, carried first by Saint's own later appearances, and then, more permanently, through Regal's own use of those same ideas on much bigger stages. 4. Squire David Taylor. David Taylor was Regal's long-running tag team partner, first across British promotions and later in WCW and WWE as part of the Blue Bloods. Regal has repeatedly named him as one of the most naturally gifted and fundamentally sound heavyweights the sport has ever produced, a compliment he does not hand out lightly. What made Taylor stand out was the way he broke a common assumption held by many fans and even by other wrestlers. People often expect complex, delicate technical wrestling, precise wrist manipulation, tight control of an opponent's balance, quick transitions using a cravat hold around the neck, to belong naturally to smaller, quicker competitors. Taylor performed all of it while carrying a traditional heavyweight frame, and he did so with genuine fluid precision rather than looking stiff or slow. He proved that a bigger man did not have to sacrifice technical subtlety just because he already had size and raw power available to fall back on. Taylor's importance to Regal's broader philosophy connects directly back to the Lion Principle that shaped so much of Regal's thinking about weight classes and movement. A heavyweight is not supposed to move like a lighter, faster wrestler, rushing and hurrying through every exchange just to keep pace. But that restriction does not mean a heavyweight has to be clumsy, simple, or limited to basic power moves. Taylor showed that a big man could work with total technical control for an entire match, as long as his movement respected his size instead of fighting against it at every turn. He stands as proof that innovation, in Regal's worldview, always has to respect the physical reality of the body performing it. Beyond their years as a tag team, Taylor's career stretched across joint promotions, the CWA circuit in continental Europe, and both WCW and WWE in North America, giving him a range of experience that matched Regal's own path through the business, almost step for step. That shared journey through so many of the same territories is part of why their partnership felt so natural once it reached American television, built on years of trust rather than a quick pairing for a storyline. There is also something worth noting about how rare Taylor's specific combination of traits really is. Plenty of heavyweights can hit hard. Plenty of technical wrestlers can work a detailed mat sequence. Very few can do both at once, at a heavyweight size, without either the power looking exaggerated or the technical work looking slowed down to accommodate a bigger frame. Taylor managed both simultaneously for years, which is exactly the kind of rare balance Regal has spent his career trying to identify and pass on to the next generation of larger wrestlers he has trained. As a tag team specifically, the Blue Bloods relied on more than just individual skill. Tag wrestling demands its own sense of pacing, since control has to pass believably between two different bodies rather than staying with just one. Taylor's contribution to that side of Regal's education should not be underestimated, since it gave Regal direct, repeated practice at managing shared ring time with a partner whose technical instincts closely matched his own. 3. Marty Jones. Marty Jones trained Regal directly, working alongside fellow trainer Steve Peacock to build the physical foundation that Regal carried with him for the rest of his career. Jones himself was a multiple-time British World Mid-Heavyweight Champion, and his matches were built around cardiovascular endurance, combined with constant, flowing chain wrestling that rarely paused for long. The clearest example of what Jones could accomplish in the ring came in his series of matches against Terry Rudge, particularly their televised bout in 1976. Regal has singled out that specific match as essential viewing for anyone genuinely trying to learn the craft of professional wrestling. What made it so effective was the technical parity between the two competitors. Neither man held a clear physical advantage over the other, so the match naturally turned into a battle of timing, counters, and rising tempers, filled with stiff physical exchanges and intricate counterholds, all without ever losing its underlying sense of realism or credibility. Jones taught Regal something intensely practical rather than purely philosophical, that conditioning is not separate from technical skill. It is what actually enables technical skill to happen. A wrestler who cannot physically sustain himself for the length of a genuine technical battle simply cannot execute the kind of chain wrestling that Jones specialized in performing. Jones gave Regal both the blueprint for that specific style of match and, just as importantly, the physical stamina required to actually perform it himself at a high level, night after night, across an entire career. As a trainer, Jones worked alongside Steve Peacock to put Regal and other young wrestlers through the kind of demanding physical preparation that made later, more complex lessons possible in the first place. Without that foundation of stamina and chain wrestling fluency, none of the more intricate ideas Regal absorbed from Saint or Cortez would have been physically sustainable across a full match. Jones is often overshadowed by flashier names, but in a very real sense, his training work is the base that everything else on this list was built on top of. Jones also matters because of who he wrestled, not just who he trained. His matches against Rudge sit at almost the exact halfway point between the raw predatory power Rudge represented and the tighter technical rhythm that Saint and Cortez represented elsewhere on this list. Watching Jones work against Rudge gave a young Regal a live demonstration of two different, closely related philosophies colliding in real time, which is exactly the kind of practical education no amount of solo training could ever fully replace. 2. Fit Finlay. Fit Finlay is the wrestler Regal has most often called the greatest all-around professional wrestler of all time. That is about as high a compliment as Regal offers anyone in this sport, and it reveals almost everything about what he genuinely values. Finlay worked across joint promotions in the United Kingdom, the CWA tournament circuit in Germany and Austria, and major American promotions including WCW and WWE, and at every single stop along the way, his matches carried the exact same underlying quality. Nothing about them ever looked cooperative or staged. Finlay applied his holds with real mechanical torque behind them. His positioning in the ring trapped opponents in genuinely awkward, disadvantageous spots, rather than convenient ones designed purely for visual effect. His strikes carried authentic physical impact rather than the appearance of impact. Put together, his overall approach operated across three connected ideas: physical legitimacy achieved through contact that looked and felt entirely real, spatial control achieved through smart, deliberate use of the corners and ropes, and an unrelenting heel mentality that never once softened itself to make the crowd more comfortable. To Regal, Finlay stands as proof that professional wrestling reaches its very highest level, both as a genuine art form and as effective entertainment, when it is presented honestly as a believable physical struggle, rather than as a choreographed display. Every value Regal holds dear about legitimacy, stiffness, and ring command finds its clearest and most complete expression somewhere in Finlay's long career. He is not simply one influence sitting among many others on this list. He sits closest to the finished ideal that Regal has been chasing across his entire life in wrestling, which explains why the word best attaches itself to Finlay's name more consistently than to anyone else here. Finlay's career stretched from the 1970s all the way into the 2000s, giving him one of the longest and most varied resumes of anyone on this list. He moved from British rings to European tournament circuits to major American promotions without ever softening his style to fit a new audience. That consistency across 3 decades and multiple continents is a large part of why Regal treats him less as a single influence and more as a walking demonstration of what the entire philosophy looks like when it is executed at the absolute highest level, night after night, for 30 years. It is worth noticing that Finlay sits at number 2 rather than number 1, even carrying the specific title of greatest all-around wrestler. That distinction matters. Being the most complete, most consistently excellent wrestler across every category is an extraordinary achievement, and Regal clearly recognizes it as such. But Regal's ranking here is personal, not purely a measure of overall skill. There is still one name that means more to him on a personal level than even Finlay's remarkable consistency, and that name sits at the very top of this list, for reasons that go beyond technique alone. Finlay's heel psychology deserves its own mention, separate from his physical stiffness. A wrestler can hit hard and still fail to convince an audience they are genuinely dangerous if their attitude in the ring does not match the impact of their offense. Finlay never softened that attitude to make himself more likable, and that refusal to pander is part of why his matches felt like genuine threats rather than performances. Regal took that same refusal to soften his own heel work into his championship runs, treating an unpleasant, uncooperative attitude as a technical tool rather than simply a personality choice. 1. Terry Rudge. At the very top of this list sits Terry Rudge, the wrestler Regal has named as his personal favorite of all time and the direct blueprint for his own in-ring persona. Rudge wrestled through the 1970s and into the 1980s, across joint promotions and all-star wrestling, and his style deliberately avoided anything showy or cosmetic. His matches were built on dense, grinding mat work, hard European uppercuts, and extremely precise targeting of specific parts of an opponent's body. Rudge did far more than simply wrestle in front of a young Regal from across an arena. He mentored him personally during Regal's early 20s, and in doing so he handed down a way of thinking about wrestling that Regal has carried with him ever since. Rudge sorted wrestlers into categories based on predatory cats, each one matched carefully to a specific weight class. Lightweights, in this system, move like cheetahs, relying relying on rapid acceleration and quick, evasive footwork. Middleweights move like pumas, balancing agility with a bit more underlying power. Light heavyweights move like panthers or tigers, blending patient stalking with sudden, explosive bursts of impact. And heavyweights, Rudge insisted without exception, have to move like lions. A lion does not rush. It does not waste energy or motion chasing something it can simply wait patiently to arrive. Regal carried that lion philosophy with him through his entire championship career in both WCW and WWE, and he later passed that exact same idea on to modern heavyweights he personally trained. 10 different careers, spanning 4 different weight divisions and more than 60 years of wrestling history, all point back toward the same small set of ideas. Once a young Regal absorbed one match, one lesson, and one mentor at a time. Hit with real weight behind every strike. Sell pain with real, consistent honesty from start to finish. Move the way your particular body is actually built to move, never fighting against your own physical scale. And never, under any circumstance, let the struggle look easy or convenient. That is the kind of wrestler William Regal has spent his entire life searching for, studying, and eventually training, and these are the 10 men who came closest to actually being him. Whether or not every fan agrees with exactly where Regal draws his lines, it is hard to look at these 10 careers side by side and doubt the depth, the consistency, or the sheer amount of thought behind the philosophy connecting all of them together. What makes this particular list so different from the usual favorite wrestler countdown is that it was never really about entertainment value in the way most fans measure it. It is closer to a coach's private notebook, quietly handed over for anyone willing to pay attention. Each name represents a specific problem Regal once had to solve as a young wrestler. Whether that problem was how to hit convincingly, how to escape a hold without looking weak, how to move at his own size, or how to make a crowd care about him at all. 10 different men solved 10 different pieces of that same puzzle long before Regal ever became the wrestler, the trainer, or the executive people know today. And he has spent the decades since making sure none of those lessons were ever lost along the way.